Atheists often pride themselves on being rational. They say that Christians and other people who believe in God are illogical, irrational, that they believe in a God for which no evidence exists. And on those grounds, they often pat themselves on the back for being so eminently logical. I would like to contest their conclusion and their viewpoint, and I do this on a couple of grounds. First, I believe that there is evidence for God's existence, and pretty good evidence at that. I'll get to that in a moment. Second, I think that they tend to confuse evidence with proof. Evidence and proof are not the same thing. There is evidence for God's existence. It's not proof, but it's evidence nonetheless. Why am I drawing this distinction? Well, consider a court of law. The prosecution might bring out, say, photographs of the murder scene, photographs of a trail of blood. They might bring out DNA samples. They might bring out the smoking gun or some other murder weapon. None of these things by themselves prove who committed the crime, but they are pieces of evidence. In other words, they are bits of information that we must consider and weigh in order to arrive at a conclusion. That's the way it is with God. We might not be able to prove God's existence, but we have pieces of information that should guide us toward a conclusion. For example, the birth of the universe. Modern physics tells us that the universe came into existence at some point. If there was a big bang, there must be a big banger. That's the most rational explanation as far as I'm concerned. Someone might propose an alternate explanation for that. For example, someone might say that, well, maybe the universe is constantly expanding and contracting in a never-ending cycle. So really the Big Bang really came about after some big crunch. And we're going to have an infinite series of Big Bangs and big crunches and so forth. But that doesn't mean the evidence isn't there. That's simply offering an alternate explanation for the birth of the universe. It's an alternate explanation for the evidence. The evidence is still there. Merely offering an alternate explanation doesn't disprove the existence of the evidence itself. Frankly, I think that explanation is a bit strained. There is simply no evidence that the universe is in this never-ending cycle. In addition, there are other pieces of evidence that we must consider. For example, the appearance of design in the universe. We know that life-prohibiting conditions are vastly more probable than life-permitting conditions. This is evidenced by the work of Barrow and Tipler in their book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle. They showed that unless certain constants of the universe are finely tuned, such as the speed of light, the strength of gravity, the decay rate of protons, and so forth, life could not possibly come into being. Now, they were not arguing from a theological viewpoint. They didn't use this to conclude that God must exist. In fact, they tried to come up with an alternate explanation, what's known as the Anthropic Cosmological Principle that I mentioned earlier. But the point remains that there is evidence of finely tuned design in the universe. I'm just talking about the constants of the universe themselves. I'm not even talking about the incredible complexity of the human body or the ecosystems and so forth and so on. Now, someone might propose an alternate explanation for those things. They might say it was evolution and random chance, for example. But the point remains that the evidence is still there. You might come up with an alternate explanation, but that doesn't mean that you don't have evidence. I personally think these alternate explanations are less likely and less probable than the existence of God, especially when you consider the totality of the evidence. You have other arguments, such as axiological and noological philosophical arguments. I won't go into those right now. Suffice to say that you can look those terms up if you'd like. You have arguments from morality. You have arguments from historical grounds. As a Christian, I believe that there is abundant evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Again, we don't have time for that now, but you can look up the writings of Gary Habermas, William Lane Craig, Michael Licona, and many others. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the best explanation for many historical facts, such as the conversion of Paul, such as the willing martyrdom of the apostles, such as the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus Christ, and so forth and so on, the empty tomb, which the vast majority of skeptical scholars acknowledged. They acknowledged that the tomb was indeed found empty. In short, I think there's plenty of evidence that should guide us toward believing in God. When someone says that there is no evidence for God's existence, they're overstating the case tremendously. That simply is not the case. Disagree with the interpretation of the evidence, if you will, but you cannot claim that there is no evidence at all. Frankly, I think that God's existence is by far the most reasonable and the most rational explanation for the piece of evidence that I've just mentioned in passing. And I hope that you'll consider that as well. I could talk about the evidence of changed lives. I think we all know people who've gone through religious conversions and whose lives have been changed very much for the better. A skeptic might point at people whose lives were not changed dramatically, but that's beside the point. Perhaps those were not genuine conversions, or perhaps those people are fighting God. It would be foolish to dismiss the evidence of changed lives right from the start. At the very least, it's something you must consider in weighing the evidence and arriving at a conclusion as to whether God exists or not. As I said, I think the evidence is more than enough.